We are back for another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I am joined by my companions, Emily Jashinksy, Chris Bedford, and Dave Marcus, who are seated in a different order for some reason. I don't know why that happened. We obviously had our live stream last night that was a huge success. Thanks to all of you who tuned in and who kept track of both Dave's cigarette count and Chris's drink count. The slurring was an excellent addition to the evening's analysis. That's the kind
slowed as my anger sobered me.
That's the kind of quality content that you won't find on traditional media. I want to
You're
run.
welcome, America.
I want to run through anymore. Yeah, the good old days. I wanted to run through a couple of your reactions to what we've seen happen overnight and continuing into the morning. A number of different developments. Obviously, last night it became clear around midnight that this was not going to be resolved, and that you didn't have a real situation where you would be able to, come away from the evening with a clear victor in the presidential election. That being said, right now I think that we have some things coming into focus. I'll lay out my own opinions right now, and so feel free to disagree with them. But
wrong.
Yes, on a level of 1 to 10. There is a clear bias, let's say, in favor of Biden winning Wisconsin and winning Michigan. Mm-hmm. And I think winning Nevada, though that may be a little bit more questionable because there's so many ballots that are uncounted and won't apparently be counted until Thursday. I don't know the reason for that. But my opinion is that a Republican winning Nevada means he really, really has to win Nevada. Like, you have to be running away. It's a very corrupt state. I do love it, though. The bigger questions are about Arizona and Pennsylvania. Arizona, obviously, being a situation where there's a whole Fox News factor involved. They called it much earlier than everyone else, after also delaying their call on the Florida state situation. That's their own business, obviously. But there's a number of different people out there saying that there's a huge amount of outstanding ballots have not been counted, particularly from Maricopa County, and that we can't really necessarily assume what those ballots look like based on when they were sent in. And then there's also the situation in Pennsylvania. Many people have said all along that Pennsylvania would end up being the deciding state, the tipping state in terms of deciding this election. And the way it's setting up right now, it certainly looks like that could be the case. So tell me a little bit in terms of your own processing of what's going on here. What do you think of as being significant aspects of this? We know in Wisconsin, the Trump campaign is calling for a full recount. They've already filed a lawsuit in Michigan, and I assume that they'll do so in other states as well. This is now moving into that legal conversation. Let's start at the end. Dave, what are your thoughts about this now versus last night, and where you see this going?
I mean, I think we are moving into legal situations in some of these states. I mean, I thought going into last night that Pennsylvania would be more or less dispositive. It looks like it might be. I mean, maybe it's not if all of those other states fall in line for Biden. I mean, the narrative of 2016 was that Trump pulled an inside straight. Maybe the narrative of 2020 is that Biden pulls this inside straight. I mean, we're going to have to wait and count the votes. But look, the big takeaway clearly from last night is that there was no repudiation of Trump or Trumpism or of the GOP. So, if the GOP is holding the Senate, all of this packing the court stuff is off the table, all this DC statehood. So, we're in a very different place than I think the media led us to believe we were going to be today. I mean, we were supposed to be looking at, blue domination for the rest of our lifetimes, yeah. and that doesn't seem to have shaken out.
I want to read you, Emily, this tweet from Andrea Mitchell from August 6th. Ana Navarro, big get for Team Obama. Biden camp taps GOP Trump foe to rev up Latino voters.
Somebody thinks Ana Navarro's Sorry.
No.
That's Andrea Mitchell. That's respected Andrea Mitchell, whose bio reads NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent.
Foreign affairs correspondent. Florida is foreign to Andrea Mitchell. No, but I mean, like, those of us who use Twitter as sort of like the bubble watch app instead of for our own masturbatory purposes.
It is not a source of knowledge. It is a source of seeing other people mismanage knowledge, tracking it in live real time.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead.
Right, no, exactly. And so I remember that tweet, and there were other people who posted similar sentiments, like, woo-hoo-hoo, Biden has Ana Navarro, it's about to get real in Florida. And I remember people who use Twitter's, like, the Bubble Watch app, laughing at that. I mean, obviously that's hilarious, but the people who purport to have the knowledge and to be the keepers of the knowledge, they thought Ana Navarro was a big get for Joe Biden in Florida, and what instead we saw happening were Hispanics and Cuban Americans particularly rejecting Biden in higher numbers than the keepers of the knowledge understood. And this is basically what we saw happening with the white working class in the Rust Belt states in 2016. But it's just incredible how they sent their reporters to Florida. Some of these big corporate media outlets have reporters in Florida. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it's obviously a helpful thing, but as a member of the media, you're so divorced from the general public that it's actually really hard for them to cover it, period, unless they say to themselves, I'm going to empathize with the people that I'm covering. I'm going to engage with the people that I'm covering, and I'm going to be among the people I'm covering, not just sort of like holed up in the newsroom on Twitter all day, snickering at people in MAGA hats.
The dynamic that we saw and I think continue to see in this election is Donald Trump losing certain factions of his base from 2016, but also gaining incredibly among a more diverse population, increasing his level of support among African Americans, particularly African American men, and also overwhelmingly increasing his support among Hispanic voters. Chris, as you look at the different dynamics that were going on in this election, do you think, I mean, one of the things we talked about last night was the irony of a situation where Trump didn't maybe deliver as much for white working class Americans or for white suburbanites in the upper Midwest and the Rust Belt, and that ended up creating a dynamic where, you know, if he had been sort of more Trumpy in perhaps his policy prescriptions or in the issues that he talked about this cycle, do you think that he would be doing better in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, all states that you visited?
The working class folks that we spoke to, whether they were fishermen or dairy farmers or folks who worked in garages or had small stores, people who worked generally with their hands I don't think they could have gotten more Trumpy. Mm-hmm. The only thing that had disappointed them was how many of them had gone to the first debate, turned it on like they were going to see the first Star Wars prequel. Like and it just shattered their dreams and made them very sad. The third one I was hearing from people in those states, in Wisconsin particularly, really turned that around and made a lot of people feel differently. But it does come down to that suburban voter that everyone was really worried about, and especially it comes down to if Donald Trump is not on the ticket again next round, whether if he loses this time, doesn't run again, or just if he wins this time and won't run again, then how is the next Republican candidate going to get remotely that level of support? And they're certainly not going to win back. Suburban voters who actually have left and are disgusted, aren't going to come back overnight. But it does bode well for him, the Hispanic switch and the working class switch, I'd say, in Arizona and Nevada. And it's looking good right now. Like, this is all pins and needles. We don't know. Mm-hmm. But if Joe Biden wins Michigan and Wisconsin, which are looking likely, and Donald Trump wins Pennsylvania, which, despite the machinations which we're going to investigate in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh,
literally, you're about to leave.
Yeah, we have a rental car outside. looks
Bad
likely.
things are going to happen in Philadelphia.
Looks likely that he's going to win in Pennsylvania. Then it comes down in Alaska. Then it comes down to he has to win either Arizona or Nevada.
Yeah,
it's going to be only one of those states. Now, Arizona. Here, the Republicans are saying good things on the ground, but they're not putting up a strong fight. The Republican Governor Ducey, is not making noise, and that's very surprising. Well, his team is working overtime to let people know like this is not remotely decided. Nevada, I have no idea.
Yeah, I want to read a couple of things that Emily, you quoted a piece today on the Federalist. One is from Politico Playbook, Pelosi's Political Playbook. Everybody should read it every morning to understand how great Nancy Pelosi is, both as a person and as a comedian. Tuesday was an abject disaster for Democrats in Washington. To imagine the amount of soul searching and explaining the party will have to do after Tuesday is absolutely dizzying. The infighting will be bloody as it should be. We fielded text after text from Hill Democrats Tuesday night and early Wednesday morning with existential questions about their leadership and the direction of their party. In context, that's a huge deal for them to say that. Here's Axios in their morning email. Recognize that we paid way too much attention to polls, which have even more limitations than we realize. It was a terrible night for polling. They were wrong, almost all of them, almost everywhere. Save yourself time and stop watching them so closely in elections. Understand Trump's appeal was broader than believed. He actually found new voters. Many of them were the working class white males who are the base of his base, but there were more of them.
But how is that new voters? That's not new voters.
No, but
but I mean, but that's the thing, right? I mean, that's why Nicole Hannah-Jones has to turn a whole bunch of Hispanics into white people.
Yes,
because it's unbelievable. I mean, there's just no willingness to admit that this is what's happening because it shatters their narrative to such a remarkable extent.
I have one more quote from a previous guest on the podcast, Josh Kraushaar, who writes for National Journal. And is kind of the smarter version of the conventional wisdom that you might hear in Washington. No offense, Josh. The polls, whether public surveys or internal partisan data, were really bad. Even if Biden sweeps the Midwestern blue wall states on the backs of mail-in votes, it will be by much narrower margins than the public poll suggested. Trump comfortably won Florida with a larger share of the vote than he did in 2016 against the general consensus of the public polling. And this is the valuable point he makes, it wasn't just the publicly released polling. Some of the most experienced Republican officials were relying on internal data, showed the Senate race in North Carolina was likely lost, and over a dozen House seats looking perilous for GOP representatives. Democrats thought they were running competitively in numerous red state Senate races from South Carolina to Kansas based on internal data. The numbers were badly off.
But it's Emily wrote a great piece about this. It's up at the Federalist now, and it's exactly how I feel, which is, we've seen this before, and it really takes a dumb person, like seriously a stupid person, which a lot of reporters are, or someone who never leaves Washington, D.C., ever, which is a stupid person, to even think that these models remotely correct. I mean, this is the equivalent of taking the groundhog and just smashing his head against the counter and saying, "You were wrong again, groundhog. How were you? We trusted you." And it's like, well, that's stupid.
Bill de Blasio actually did that once.
Bill de Blasio, that wasn't an axe.
All right.
But this is what's there's an important distinction that a lot of people who are more casual observers of politics might not realize, is that all of these campaigns have internal polling.
Yeah.
And what we've learned is that not even these internal expensive polls, that, one of the things that they're spending any money that you're donating to a campaign on is polling. And these expensive polls, one thing that we learned is that even the internals were off.
Yeah.
So basically the bottom line right here is that pollsters in America do not know how to poll the American people anymore. And that's not just for reasons that have to do with Trump. It's for technological reasons. It's for all kinds of reasons. But it's bullshit.
But
we're not just 4 years off of Madam President on Newsweek. We were like 70 years after Dewey beats Truman.
Yeah.
One of the most famous pictures of domestic politics of the 20th century.
But let me play devil's advocate, and I really do mean the devil, because they do come from Satan. The media is not going to change anything about what they do.
No, they're going to get worse.
Not. And the reason is we've seen them do this before. After 2016, they didn't change what they did.
They got worse.
I think it was Thomas Sheridan Williams, it might have been somebody else, retweeted somebody today, pointing out that in the run-up to this election, the New York Times didn't publish a single piece by anyone who was in any way a Trump supporter. Now, after 2016, there was this whole thing, well, we need to understand what's going on in the country, so we should probably talk more or include more voices. And they gave some brief hand-waving at that, but it wasn't serious, and they got away from it very quickly. And instead it became this kind of dominant, no, you have to resist, you have to fight all this. And even featuring these voices is a mistake, is collaborative in some way. To me, this polling disaster, which these people have identified, and again, we're talking about corporate media that has a lot invested in the validity of these polls, particularly Axios.
Well, can we just talk about Axios just for a brief
Sure.
second? Because Mike Allen links to these polls every single day in his little newsletter in the morning, and then the morning after the election, he's saying, oh, don't ever pay attention to any of these polls. Don't be silly.
Yeah.
Sounds smart. Don't read my newsletter.
Yes.
Give it short brevity, or smart brevity, whatever he calls it. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's just an aside, but it's just a freaking joke.
Just
because this man
read
has
Jonathan
been-
Swan. He's the only person worth reading there.
Well, but the thing that is interesting
Sarah
to me is that there
Yeah,
is
she's all right.
there's a dynamic going on here where the people who are the most pissed off about this are probably people who consume the news who feel lied to. But there are also a smaller portion of people who are pissed off about this who actually have money on the line and corporate interests that depend on these polls being accurate.
Here's where I think there's a problem. I think in terms of accountability, when you look at the fractured nature of the media landscape, right? If in the 1980s ABC, CBS, NBC, the New York Times, and the Washington Post had gotten a race like this so wrong, there would have, the next day there would have been beheadings, right? There would have been like, oh my God, our credibility's shot, we have to fix this.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You're not having that now because the people who watch MSNBC versus the people who watch CNN versus the people who watch whatever these
Versus the people who
are.
watch Young Turks versus the people who watch Rising to the
versus
Peace
the people who
yesterday.
watch this, right?
Yeah, right.
Are all getting what they want out of it. And so you don't need the 50% share anymore. You only need the 12% share.
Yeah.
And as long as that's good enough, there's no reason to hold yourself accountable.
So
It's
there-
what we see in late night. It's how Colbert
Yes.
gets by.
Yes.
So there's all these pollster bros who exist on on Twitter who basically over the past 2-3 months were the most confident people in the world about knowing the outcome of this election, and they would just dismiss and laugh at and judge anybody who even said that this was not going to be a landslide. And what I found to be particularly interesting out of all of these folks was Nate Cohn, who writes for The Upshot at the New York Times, had a whole thread on Monday about how one of the big ramifications of his analysis of the 2020 election was that he would no longer guide people to the Real Clear Politics average. And to summarize his thread, which is like a 6 or 8 tweet thread, it was basically, I used to send people there because I thought it was relatively fair, but this time around they've used way too many Republican polls, particularly, the implied issue.
That's his problem.
He didn't mention it, but like the implied issue is Trafalgar and a number of these other places that are identified if you look at the average as R, like next to their name, because they say this is a Republican pollster, but does still factor in their average. So he does this whole thread, and there are a bunch of people, sycophants to these poll bros, who then come out and say, oh yes, did you see this? This is so ridiculous. The very first one, by the way, if you go to that thread, is somebody saying that the Florida one is ridiculous. The Florida one, by the way, which had Biden up.
By like 7 or something.
It was, the average for Florida was,
The RCP average?
the RCP flat average for Florida was 4.5.
Yeah. That makes
Okay,
sense.
or something, or 4 or 4.5.
Which is close to their margin of error, probably.
Basically.
Yeah.
But the point being that they were saying, oh, this is ridiculous. This is, anyway. Trump overperformed his average, the RCP average, in almost every battleground state. The only states in the battleground list of the 10 states that were there where he underperformed the RCP average are currently Arizona and Minnesota. Okay? So in other words, as an accuracy measure, the RCP average should have been more bullish for Trump. Like Trump was doing better than the RCP average. And yet Nate Cohn was dismissing it as saying, oh, this is just ridiculous. None of this will ever happen. This problem is so fundamental that I can't even begin to wrap my arms around it. I almost imagine this is a scenario where imagine people who handicapped games, but there was not the investment of the gamblers who would be mad at them for handicapping the game wrong. It's like just a person deciding, I know nothing about this sport, I'm going to handicap every game, and giving you just this mess of analysis and data that turns out to be complete garbage. But then you would have a market force that would make you not survive as a sharp, as somebody who is trying to make money off of giving your picks to people in the sports landscape.
But that's exactly what happens in the sports situation, right? Like you set the line, but once the line initially gets set, it depends on who's betting on either side, and that's how the line moves. So there always is sort of skin in the game. Now we all remember, was 2008 or was it 2000? I think it was 2012 was like the first time that everybody got like super into like prediction markets, right? And this was the whole argument.
Yeah.
Right, the whole argument was, oh, well, this is better than polling because these people actually have some skin in the game. And they do all right, But look, I think we're a society now, and I think we saw this with the coronavirus too, and this whole like trust the science, trust the experts. Right? As a society, we're trending towards this like expectation that there are some like people sitting in high towers who can tell us what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right, and it's really not that different than like ancient Greeks going to the Oracle of Delphi, right? Like they don't know.
They replace the clergy, the scientist. I mean, whether it's
look. I know that you've done your own analysis, but the bat entrails just say what the bat entrails say.
Yes, that's right. And what's really stupid about the whole darn thing is like how upfront Cohn is about this. Where it's like, listen, guys, this disagrees with me, so I'm just not going to take it seriously.
Yeah,
that's dumb.
That's my approach to you.
That's a survival tactic.
That's
I have some friends who I don't follow on social media, and there are some people who don't listen to what I say in person, and that's how we like each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so Cohn is interesting, and not to focus too heavily on him, but he is a microcosm because Cohn is somebody who will gesture at times to like the so-called objective analysis of the day. He sometimes will do these kind of nuanced dives into polls that say, off the top of my head, I'm thinking in the past he's, I believe, said, listen, the Democratic Party's base isn't as leftist as Twitter might have you think.
Yes.
So he will sometimes gesture and put himself on the line for like the Twitter mobs, whatever it is. But that's how the media sort of like thinks of itself. They think that they're fair and objective because they can bring themselves once every few months to do something like that.
And can I identify an aspect of this that I think we should not ignore, which is pollsters didn't used to be performative. Okay? Now we can blame Frank Luntz, we can blame like the advent of television wanting some kind of authoritative presence in the room. But the point is that pollsters were not always, until relatively recently in media history, viewed as these oracles that you could turn to as being the source of unobjectionable data.
Nate Silver.
How much of that is the 24-hour news cycle and the fact that this election coverage, everyone's going to have a desk of experts so they can make the call first?
I think that it's a big part of that. I think it's a big part of that. But I also think that this is a situation where if the rot goes so deep in this industry that even the people who are paying for it behind the scenes, where it's not performative, are getting bad information, then the problem goes much deeper than just the performative aspect, where stuff like the Cohn stuff that you're talking about.
You know what I thought was interesting? This was we had an email thread the other day where we were saying, who do you think, it was the maps, right? And like, I didn't do an actual prediction, but I saw John Davidson's, right?
Yeah.
And John Davidson was with Chris in Wisconsin and Michigan. And he had those going for Trump. Now, they might not, but they're closer. Yeah. They're much closer than the polls looked, right? He didn't have Pennsylvania. But he had Pennsylvania going for Biden. I had the exact opposite.
Yeah.
But I wasn't in Wisconsin and Michigan. I was in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And, the secret sauce that everybody should have learned from Selena Zito in 2016, and that I think, the editorial staff did a great job in terms of assigning all of us this year, was go there. Go.
Yeah, but don't
get on the ground.
But they do that, but they just do it in a ridiculous way.
I don't know that they really do. I mean, I don't
talked
know
to folks
that
throughout these
Times
states.
opinion writers are actually going out to.
Yeah.
I don't see
Yeah,
that.
but a lot of
That's
the places we talked to were places we went, the swing counties we went, there were Obama and then Trump, were very mistrusting of press, not simply because they were press, but because it had already been screwed by CNN.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Like CNN was here and they did a really big hit piece on us because I said they liked Trump. It's like,
But listen, like I will read, for instance, a New York Times story I'm from Waukesha County, which is always a crucial county when we're looking at elections like these. And I'll look at like a New York Times story. They'll go to like an evangelical church in Waukesha County, and they're speaking to suburban women. That's an actual piece that the Times published sometime over the past year. And you can just tell that the way that they're talking to the Times, it's not as though they would be approached by myself or Ben or Chris or Dave, which is that, like, I'm happy to talk to a Democratic voter. Of course, I'm happy to talk to a Democratic voter. In fact, I remember a few years ago, I was at Netroots and I had a conversation with Randy Bryce about intersectionality, which actually turned out to be kind of prescient. But it's when you have somebody from the New York Times talking to you and you have somebody from CNN talking to you, you're going to have a totally different dynamic than if you're talking to Tim Carney or any of us, because we empathize with you and we don't hate you.
Let's talk for a moment about the outcomes in areas other than the presidency. The House obviously was expected to have a situation where Democrats thought that they would flip a number of seats, high single digits at least, away from Republicans this time. It looks to be the opposite. It may be that Republicans won ultimately more than 10 seats, including a number of different elections that remain close. Perhaps kind of most in a real jarring situation, Sherry Bustos, the head of the Democratic Congressional Committee, ended up locked in this very, very tight race that she may looks like pull out at the end. But that is itself kind of an insult to almost take out the person who's literally in charge of them winning elections. The thing that I think is going to be interesting about that dynamic is you blunt a lot of the assumptions on the part of the social justice wing of the party. And what blunts it even further is that it's clear at this juncture that Mitch McConnell is likely to be the next majority leader of the Senate. Barring a bizarre series of circumstances, the fact that Susan Collins won, the fact that Tom Tillis has declared victory, the fact that Joni Ernst won, losing Cory Gardner and losing Martha McSally, is nowhere near enough of the kind of wave Democrats thought they were going to get that was going to result in them being able to pack the Supreme Court, get rid of the filibuster, and maybe even add 2 states to the United States.
And they lost Montana, which had been sort of chatted about in the Beltway class as a key race.
Yes. So look, we're looking at a situation here where that's a big failure, and it's why a lot of these Democrats are depressed today, even though they feel like they have the current advantage in terms of the outcome for Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. What do you think about what that dynamic does going forward? If you assume that Joe Biden is able to eke out a win in these Midwestern Rust Belt states, that as president he would be confronting a situation that is very different than the one every media member, every pollster was saying that he was going to confront, one where he won't be able to do the things that he was essentially indicating he would do for the left wing of his party.
I mean, I think it's great news for the progressive wing of the party. I think it's great news for the squad. I think that for a couple of reasons. One, losing Democrats in these swing districts just moves the House caucus to the left in general. Mm-hmm. Two, they don't have to be now the dog that caught the car. Right? They can talk about the Green New Deal and let's get rid of oil and, let's give everybody $2,000 and a puppy every month, right? Mm-hmm. Because Mitch McConnell's going to say no.
They'll be the Freedom Caucus.
Right?
Yeah.
The problem would have been, had they significantly, flipped the Senate and they got Biden and they got the House, now you're saying, all right, are we going to pull the trigger on this crazy stuff? Mm-hmm. And that would have created some tension. I think right now, they can say whatever they want.
I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I want to hear what Chris thinks about that too.
I think that, I actually think that it doesn't matter if they can say whatever they want. If Democrats had actually pulled off winning the White House and the Senate, they would have done nuclear option. And I think that we're not like operating in normal times, and the chances of pushing towards statehood for D.C. Would be much higher. Hacking the courts would be significantly higher. There are some people who say that Joe Biden wouldn't have done that. I don't think that Joe Biden would have done that 10 years ago. I don't think Joe Biden has the faculties to stop that from happening. And we would have looked at something that would have really changed this country. They can talk all they want and generally about the Green New Deal and defunding the police. I don't really think that helps them.
You know, there's actually, I want to push back on what Dave said just to some extent, is that there was a House race in in Nebraska, Kara Eastman. Now, if you haven't heard of Kara Eastman, she is kind of a squad-styled, far-left progressive running in the Omaha area, and has been latched onto by a lot of the leftist press, leftist figures, and some of whom are people that I really respect. By the way, Kara Eastman, this was when I was at the Examiner, I reported that she used to be in a band called Pieces of F Word. I don't know what it means, but that was the name of her band. She's a very funny candidate.
Pieces spelled normally or like with
Pieces,
an E?
Pieces of F-U, Anyway, so Kara Eastman, she lost. And the message that, I'm again thinking back to this Netroots that I went to a few years ago, the far left was convinced for a very long time, and if you talk to people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, they will tell you this. If you go into working class communities, if you have a Randy Bryce in working class Wisconsin who is a bold progressive in the way that Reagan was bold for conservatism, somebody who is boldly progressive and will say Medicare for all, free college, X, Y, and Z, and is a good messenger, somebody like, what's his name in Missouri, Jason Kander.
Yeah.
You take someone like that, progressivism will win. That I do not think is true. I think Kara Eastman's loss is actually a huge blow to that argument.
There's going to be definitely some internal fracturing on the Democratic side, no matter what I think happens on the presidential level. But it's going to be really interesting because they no longer can provide any of the different carrots that were being offered to people who didn't like Joe Biden, which is, okay, from the perspective of an AOC, as she said herself, we shouldn't even be in the same party. She views him as a corporatist. She views him as someone who is not interested in dramatic change. He tried to emphasize normalcy. That led to that whole dance, that weird sort of play out that he had to do about maybe I'll get rid of fracking, maybe I won't here, that kind of thing. Instead, now he would be confronting as president a situation where he'll maybe get a tax plan out of the first 2 years. I mean, maybe, but that's pretty much it, because it's going to have to pass muster with a majority Senate on Republican side that is even more invested and more Trumpian than it was before. The fact is that the people who look at this map right now, who look at the scenario here, say, you know what, in a normal election year, outside of a global pandemic, this looks like a landslide. This looks like a landslide for Republicans. It looks like a situation where, we would not even be confronting this scenario because we have a more diverse and we have a younger group of people voting for us than we typically have. And that's something that I think, a lot of Republicans wanted to achieve. They just didn't know that Donald Trump was going to be the person who achieved it.
They're going to have swagger. If Trump loses, the Republican Party is going to have swagger because they're feeling good about all of this. The inroads they made with minorities, however big or small they turn out to be, they feel like they're a better party for having gone through the Trump era. And that's, people can disagree with that, but they're going to have swagger.
The GOP is a better party. I mean, the whole single issue voters thing that Democrats and Republicans have done, that working class white people just want government assistance and union support, which they got rid of They got rid of the union support and just had the government assistance aspect. The Hispanic voters just want unlimited immigration and more illegals in the country. That black voters just want welfare. That's pretty stupid. And the foretelling the Donald Trump, the working class vote that came to Trump in 2016 and 2020, that was white, all the Democrats were like, wow, we've lost the white working class. And no one thought, maybe the working class black and Hispanic community can't afford to have these absolute peak luxury, like put them in Playboy magazine luxury, problems that is the entire Democratic core right now, like structural racism and remaking history books. Like maybe they have the exact same concerns. We should stop being so racist as a huge amount of the white working class. Wouldn't that be kooky?
That was Kamala Harris's pitch before she got into the vice presidential race. She was like on this kick about what she would come to call her 3 a.m. policy, but she said identity politics should be rejected by Democrats because when people are going to sleep or when they're awake at 3 in the morning, they're not thinking about
She has a transgender
issues.
flag outside her office.
Right.
It's the first time I'd ever seen one. Like years ago, I was like, what is that flag? I thought it was actually a Methodist flag because I'd only seen that in Methodist churches before. But it turned out it was
What were
no,
you
it
doing
was
in a Methodist church?
I walked by one in Boston, and it was that's a Kamala flag.
You said you were in one.
It was in the window of the rectory.
All right.
The head of that rectory.
So let's wrap this up with this. Looking at the scenario as it plays out now, I think that there's no question that we are going to be in a week to 2 weeks of serious legal battles that may drift well beyond that regarding these various states. We've seen the early actions on the part of the campaign. There's going to be a drumbeat that I think we can all expect from right-leaning media that basically says, for the good of the country, Donald Trump needs to just say, I'm not going to fight this anymore. He shouldn't tear the country apart as the price of saving his presidency or something along those lines. That's something.
This election is not over. I woke up this morning not knowing which side I'd rather be on, to be a Democrat or Republican consultant on the presidential campaign. I don't know because I don't know which way this is going.
Well, but what I would ask you three is, what would your response be to if you were sitting down at a table in normal non-corona times, across having a beer with someone who made that argument to you? What would you say back to them?
I mean, I'd say no. I mean, I'd say obviously you have to have the legal fight, but I really think that what should happen is Clarence Thomas should step down, and in the next month, Trump should nominate himself for the Supreme Court, and Mitch McConnell should push through the Trump Supreme Court nomination, and then we can let Biden be president with a Republican Senate and Donald Trump on the Supreme Court. So that's what I'd like to see.
Amy Coney Barrett doesn't have to recuse herself from anything and can write MAGA as her opinion for every decision she ever makes on the bench for her entire time. Just a lifetime appointment, just MAGA.
Emily, what do you think?
Handmade.
I actually do think, hold on, I want to say something. Be real quick. I think that fortunately these weak-kneed, bleeding heart Republicans are not actually in charge of the White House. They haven't been in charge of the White House since they lost the nomination to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's not gonna listen to like Charlie Cook or whoever else says, maybe you should just tuck it in.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely not.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I tend to be one of those like people that's still kind of concerned about the Trumpian norm breaking, and I still don't know if I'm right to be concerned about that. I think I try to actually hold back judgment because I think time will be the only way to answer that question. But, if he doesn't have any reason and it's baseless, which does happen sometimes, and he's just wildly swinging and saying, we need to recount every vote 3 times or whatever it is. No, I don't want to hear that. But at the same time, this is an unprecedented level of mail-in voting. We've already seen
Mail-in vote parades.
Right. We've already seen weird stuff happening. There is plenty of reason right now to be concerned about the legitimacy of where we're standing right now, at least.
Yeah.
And so if you're saying that nobody should have any concerns about what we've seen play out in counting ballots over the last 24 hours, that's ridiculous.
I'll say it's extremely unlikely. You've seen a lot of elections. It's very uncommon for elections to go boom, 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 beep, 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 and then start to dial back. This is the nightmare scenario. I mean, Democrats, some people might say this is normal, this is part of the coronavirus thing. But I tell you what, it plays into serious professional Republicans, not in the White House, but like not Donald Trump people, like serious professional Republicans, worst nightmare scenarios for what they were worried could happen. And if Donald Trump's going to need to practice messaging discipline, which is going to be unlikely, and they're going to have to let the folks at the RNC who have the lawyers ready and the White House to just move in there and start the lawsuits.
Look, in 1960, Richard Milhous Nixon decided not to contest the results of that election heavily, despite the fact that it was clearly stolen on JFK's behalf, in part because he was someone who had a long, in his view, political future, one that he would be able to perhaps become president again, as he obviously did. That is not the scenario confronting Donald Trump right now. There's no reason for him not to just go to the mattresses on this stuff. And frankly, I think, to Emily's point, there's already a lot of hinky stuff happening. And given the states that we're talking about, there's going to continue to be a lot of questions given the authority involved. In Florida, in 2000, it was mostly about one county. This time, it's about multiple states, potentially, multiple lawsuits and multiple recounts. And it's going to be a pretty crazy thing to follow. So I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. Thank you all for joining me for this conversation today. We'll be back soon with more.
And
until then,
tune into Philadelphia.
yeah.
We're going to be covering.
Yeah.
And Arizona.
Yes, we will have people on the ground in both places by the end of the day. And so tune in to that on social media and wherever you find your Federalist content. I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.